I could hear and smell him arrive, right before I saw him walk through the glass double doors of the hotel lobby. I told him I'd meet him in the morning, around 11 a.m. to be exact, and if he wanted to ask questions, I would be available to answer them. I don't think he believed me when I said I would be there, and that I truly was a succubus, but he promised he would be there at the correct time. There were people buzzing around. Their arrival at the destination brought considerable noise that I managed to drown out. Their idle chatter and footsteps as they carried their bags for their stay. I saw him enter, and he looked around, trying to place me among all the strangers inside the lobby. He thought an occasional redhead or blonde could have been me, then thought better of it. It was tempting to let him linger in the unknown. I pulled my energy back to make my body invisible to the naked eye. Unless he knew exactly where I am and what to look out for, he'd never know I was there. I smirked as I toyed with my prey. I watched as his head turned, once, twice, and finally it lingered too long on the exit, pondering leaving to maintain what's left of his sanity, and that dignity of his. His sandy blonde hair brushed back from his face, in sheer frustration, a flush on his tan cheeks, and he started a swift pace back and forth for a couple of minutes. Perhaps a guilty conscience plagued him. Still, his attention would occasionally drift toward the door, pondering leaving and abandoning his quest to seek out a succubus. When he looked over the crowded room, I gave him a flash of my true form, and he stopped dead in his tracks. Dread, lust, the embodiment of life and death. The reflection of the coffee table gave me a glimpse. Grey skin, 2 sharp horns for my skull, with dark shoulder-length hair, a curvaceous body with no clothing to adorn it, and 2 bat-like wings with barbed points. My nakedness brought me no shame, a natural state that served as a gift. But most of all, eyes that glowed in the darkness, and within the blink of an eye, I drew it back to the form I used when I was traveling around, willing to be seen, but not expose myself. The image of a young woman, a slender physique with striking eyes, a black gown around my body, and my eyes highlighted with kohl. My guest approached me from a distance, yet I caught the attention of another. A man in a scruffy grey business suit, with even greyer hair, approached me and asked if I offered intimate services, and while the temptation was offered, I mentally inserted myself into his mind. He was here on a business trip, his family on the opposite side of the world, and believed he'll be out of sight and out of mind. My top lip curled in distaste. The scent of being on the road was off-putting. It wouldn't be the first time he would try to lay with someone during one of these business trips. Explaining this process to mortals is difficult. Imagine doing the same with a caveman, explaining quantum physics or other scientific exploits. I squeezed inside his rather empty mind, twisting and turning, molding flesh to my will. His hand clutched his chest, and his face went bright red as he panted roughly, unevenly, as he struggled to breathe. He left to go to the reception desk, and the one who I'd come to see stood across from me, debating whether or not he should sit down or wait for the invitation. The earlier one collapsed on the floor, soon surrounded by hotel staff who called an ambulance for him or knelt down to ensure he was fine. I imagined he would live. However, these trips were now out of the question.
Hello, I am...
My guest finally gained his confidence. He stepped forward with fake bravado, stopped with his mouth open, staring in concern over the fate of the gray-haired one.
I hope he will be okay.
My sandy-haired guest looked over. The sweat on his brow showed his nervousness, and his attention turned back to me. So many questions raced through his mind that he didn't know where to begin, and I wasn't about to help him. "Sit," I instructed gently, uncurling my fingertips in the direction of the chair across from me. It would give us a moment to speak intimately, while people around us conducted themselves, unaware of what was among them. He stumbled, near tripping over the chair, and pulled it toward him before he sat down. There was no equipment, nor any technology of documenting the conversation that would take place. Perhaps he had a photogenic memory, or originally thought he was being fooled by a delusional woman with lust in mind. Odd, however, not too far from the norm.
Hello, I'm Stephen. Nice to meet you.
His hand offered a shake, a gesture I'd seen over many centuries during my life, and I kept my hands where they were, unwilling to touch him. A raised eyebrow and a neutral expression told him I wasn't interested. A handshake was for equals, and he, far beneath me. He withdrew his hand, placed it on his lap, and looked around nervously at the rest of the people, going about their lives, completely oblivious.
Okay, I'm not sure what to ask you. There are so many questions I could ask.
Stephen stumbled over his words. So excited to be here. Our initial meeting was by chance.
I still can't believe you are real. I wasn't sure who you'd be or whether somebody was playing a prank on me.
I knew he was tempted to reach out to touch me, to caress my thigh, to feel the curve of my breast, or the softness of my lips, to see if my grey body was akin to a statue, or living flesh. Perhaps he had been dreaming, or wondered whether a mere touch was enough to destroy him. Fortunately for him, he thought better, and kept his hands to himself. He stared foolishly. A line of drool escaped his lips, and his hand reached up to catch it.
What can you tell me about your life? Your kind? How were you born? How old are you? How do you choose your victims?
Stephen asked excitedly, one after another, and would have continued if I didn't raise my hand to slow him down. While he stopped asking questions verbally, inside his mind, even more were being thrown around. A majority were about physical congress, whether he would touch me, or if I would take him. One question at a time. Which one do you want to know first? Stephen paused, thinking to himself, and finding which one he landed on. Needless to say, it was right to the point.
How do you choose your victims? Is it at random, or do you select based on whatever criteria?
Not the one I expected, and I had a lingering feeling that he wanted to become my latest. A fingertip rested on my lips. A manicured fingernail appeared briefly as a black claw. His eyes widened with a better look at me, and I figured I would permit him to continue viewing me as I am, without the illusion that temporarily put them at ease. I wonder which tale you would expect from me. A long hunt, slowly bringing down a man's defenses until I get a chance to feed, slowly draining him dry, and watching his life fall into ruin around him. It is meticulous, akin to a scientist discovering a new species. However, all I have found are the same. I smiled, and he shifted in his seat. There are times when I am an opportunistic feeder, taking the prey that falls into my lap. Visibly, he perked up at this part, hoping he would be among them.
What about their morality? Do you aim for good men or wicked men? Is there a difference in taste?
Stephen asked, leaned forward with ever-present curiosity, and his gaze lingered beneath my eyes, both in lust and fear.
I've often wondered how you choose them. You refused the man who approached you before I did, but still talked to me.
He pondered to himself, having to lift his gaze away from me periodically.
And in some of the stories, legends, I suppose there are those of...
Still unwilling to admit these stories came from his own imagination.
your kind preferring virgins.
I nearly burst out laughing. Instead, I tilted my chin upward and smiled to reveal a fang. I'm curious. When you go to a restaurant, what questions do you ask the waiter? Is the food gluten-free? Free range? If the chicken has lived a virtuous life? Or if it lived one of depravity? He avoided my gaze now. Perhaps realizing his line of questioning, and there was some truth in what he never asked. And most of all, do you think they taste better or worse?
I can't say I ever thought about it.
He admitted.
He had an expensive suit, watch, you name it. He probably has a high salary, and yet you rejected him.
Stephen pondered and glanced down at his own clothing, and pulled on it to emphasize his point. As for the wealth you speak of, the trappings are a signal to your kind, not mine. Men look the same when they're stripped of all.
I understand your point.
I plagued him with memories of my past conduct, luring men regardless of status, pushing them to the brink of death and back again, bodies wound tightly together, hips gyrating, as I would feed repeatedly. Humans often forgot about morality when it suited them. Since my kind live among yours, the death and destruction of wicked men is often unnoticed, or even desired among humans. As for virgins, would you desire something that has already been eaten? He shut up, not wishing to continue, and I did the same, unwilling to share all the mysteries.
And what about your life? Wait, what can you tell me about how you were born, and your family?
He asked all the questions excitedly, knowing I was the real thing, and finally able to get his chance. I began my journey with a dance and a pledge to a forgotten goddess. Her name irrelevant, and differs throughout history, but her purpose remains the same. Born of mortal flesh and touched by immortality, I began my journey in a temple of lust, taking lovers in my mouth, and their devotion to her taken from my flesh. I brought many to climax at differing speeds, my own method of worship, as I fed her, while the oracles decided what her messages were. I saw his eyes light up, and his imagination took hold. While he did, my memories recalled the embraces, the feel of the first feeding, and my body lose its humanity until I became something else. He imagined an ancient temple with large pillars, many figures on the wall in a variety of intimate positions, an orgy of human bodies, wreathing together under the shadow of a stone goddess, staring down at us, while the flames were guarded by priestesses, their moans and cries of lust endless. Many prolonged to boost their final climax, and his grip on the arm of the chair tightened. The memory eased and passed as though it was never there. And finally, he returned his attention back to me.
That's an incredible beginning. Are all your kind born the same way?
He breathed, caught up in the memory that didn't belong to him. Few, if any, are born. Most are turned, and I don't believe any more have been created this way. I pondered more, trying to think of the last time one of my kind had been born. There has not been a new sister born for hundreds of years.
Could I be turned?
I raised an eyebrow, and didn't grace it with a response. no doubt wishing he could take many lovers, forgetting there was more involved in the process. He gulped and looked around with a dry throat, wishing he had brought a drink, both to grant him courage and to moisten his throat. He left to get some water, fearful over what could eventually happen, and brought over 2 glasses and a green glass bottle of water. He poured one for me first, then did one for himself and took a gulp. Stephen eyed my glass intently, and his hand trembled. I didn't even need to glance down to know. I waited for him to finish, while questioning my reasons for doing this.
What happens when you feed? Do you feed on the,
He desperately tried to think of the polite term for it. He squirmed, and I wasn't about to assist him either. I didn't reach out for the glass. I smiled and revealed my fangs to him. I couldn't tell if he was more scared or aroused by it. With every encounter, I find myself becoming more fascinated by the concept of humanity and their innate strengths, weaknesses, hopes, dreams, and fears. I answered, paused, and thought to myself about the best way to answer, without spilling information that could be used against my kind.
I feel like you're studying me.
He chuckled awkwardly and tried to disguise it by sipping his drink. There is more than one method, I answered. My voice echoed inside his mind. He imagined my arm around his shoulders, trailing down his chest, beneath the fabric of his shirt, and I could feel his breath change, his heart rate increase, and it got louder as the mental image of my hand rested just above his groin. It is through dreams where we are able to play on their subconscious. They know we aren't there, yet it all feels so real. Both my physical and dream forms whispered. Stephen lifted his hips upward in an attempt for me to take him in my hand, and instead, the image's hand moved down his thigh, the curve of my breast against the back of his head. The dream version's lips caressed along his jawline and rested just under his earlobe. He exposed his neck, and slowly the image began to fade. The fangs gently grazed his neck as a parting gift. Sometimes it is blood that is taken, or the climax, and everything including the final breath. Most did not die. However, I don't think he understood my meaning, or, at this point, the intent behind my words. I completely withdrew the image, sharply, and he choked, looking around confused in his lust-filled state. The spell broken, he aimed to conceal his arousal from the scandalized onlookers who hurried to get away from him. They whispered together, pointed, and fortunately for him, they were not staff members. He covered himself up. I caught him gaze toward the doors, and the longing for them.
I don't know what to say.
Stephen answered, flustered, and tried to focus on the questions at hand.
How many people do you feed on per year?
His voice was raspy, trying repeatedly to distract himself. Another question was on the tip of his tongue, and I lifted my hand to bid him to stop. I feed on several people per year, both for survival purposes and for pleasure. Some end up serving another's interests other than my own, I answered, unwilling to mention the names of the 2 deities who influence my world. And fortunately, Stephen was too preoccupied with his previous predicament to notice I hadn't given him a precise number.
How does it feel for them when you feed?
He questioned, ever curious. I knew he wished to feel it himself, and perhaps, soon enough he would. It depends. Some enjoy the suffering, crave it even, while others are fearful.
Can you give me an example?
Are you asking me to test you to see which you prefer? His blushing cheeks suggested I was right. However, instead he said,
No. I'd like to hear about an encounter, if you would be willing to share, that is.
I regarded him silently, the flush on his cheeks, and I noticed the hotel staff kept a close eye on him, a hand on their phones, primed and ready to call security if he continued. I pointed my finger in their direction. He turned his head and accepted the warning. Later, you will find out. I whispered in his mind. Either will happen soon, or in many long years from now.
Do they feel different when you feed for survival versus pleasure?
He tried to bring it back to the previous topic. I thought for a moment, looked out in the crowd for some worthwhile examples, and my gaze moved from him to them. Not so discreetly, Stephen's attention focused on the elderly woman, who stood with her bored-looking grandson in his early 20s. The pair of them were chatting with each other in a wholesome family moment. Some food is bland, with little flavor, and they'll be like the grandmother. Then there is food that tastes pleasurable and is healthy for you. That would be like the young man. I scanned the hotel lobby again. Fortunately, there was a constant stream of new people arriving and departing from the building. I craved another example when he spoke up.
Ah, I expected that. You prefer healthy and younger people.
I heard the harsh, raspy coughing of a person with breathing tubes. The aroma of death was on them, and their skin deprived of blood flow. It would not be long until death would claim them, and that would be considered a need for survival. All the chemicals in the blood, the body breaking down. It would not be pleasurable. It would even be dangerous for my kind. I thought to myself, unwilling to share this piece of information. Stephen's chair creaked when he turned back to face me, a somber look on his face, and I could tell he felt guilty. About what? I was pretty sure.
I'm surprised your kind would feed on someone so...
He tried to grasp the most polite phrase possible.
unsuitable. I can't imagine a succubus being deprived to a point where they'd have to feed on someone with a terminal illness. Your kind aren't what I imagined, or at least, not what I've heard about.
Stephen's voice trailed off, and was unwilling to continue. He avoided looking at me, and I'd certainly seen the newer depictions of my kind. And what exactly did you imagine me to be like? I asked. Finally, I reached out to lift the offered glass of water, and took a sip.
I thought you would have taken me up to the hotel room and instantly started...
He paused. I didn't break eye contact, and he sucked his lips. I could have just read his mind. Instead, I wanted him to vocalize it.
You know, being intimate with me. I thought...
Oh, he hoped. And I knew.
You would practically pounce on me, fuck my brains out, and I would have an incredible memory to remember for all time. A real life experience with a succubus. And being able to live to tell the tale.
Stephen couldn't help smiling now, practically beaming until he remembered who he was speaking to. He gulped, scrambled to think of a polite way to restore the conversation, and stared down with his shoulders slumped. I tapped my finger on the surface of the glass, and let out the slightest laugh at his expense. That would make an incredible tale. I cannot recall if any of my previous encounters resulted in a creative work being born. I answered. This caused him to perk up, and he relaxed back into the chair. The tension left his body. He gave a grateful smile, and looked relieved I wasn't angry with him. Would it bestow on me more immortality, with works being created in my honor? Did you have any other questions you wished to ask me? I let it hang in the air.
Yes. When was the last time you fed?
Again, my top lip drew back to reveal a fang, and a knowing look. Mere minutes ago. Stephen froze, and deep down had internal knowledge of what occurred. He had been fed on. His eyes went wide, and I heard his heart rate increase yet again, the steady pace beating faster. And he didn't even look in the direction of the door. No desire to escape what could possibly come next.
You... Earlier, when you're...
His hand moved, trying to think of a way to describe it.
When you were inside my head and you...
It was slight. He tried to hide the subtle pant, and the memory only encouraged these thoughts to continue. The lure of what might have been.
You touched me. You were feeding on me then.
I inclined my head.
You never touched me, though.
He raised. His hand moved down his chest and stomach, as though he could still feel my hand along his skin, an echo of where I had caressed him, and it only increased his longing for me. I lifted one up, curled my fingertips to show I didn't move.
What would happen if you did?
The eagerness clear, even with all the warnings I had given him. With no care for his safety, I leaned closer. The chair creaked beneath me and raised dark eyebrows. I saw my reflection in his eyes, a horned creature born of death, and he moved closer to me, without needing to be bid to comply.
What was the most memorable person you was with, and why?
Stephen asked, and I guessed he imagined me luring one powerful man into my bed after another. Are you asking me to kiss and tell? I could tell you tales of my previous escapades, of how I seduced kings, popes, presidents, shahs, and more. Yet these would be mere stories. Why not permit you to experience it, and see if you survive the process? I put it all on the table for him, allowing him to choose, and survival could not be guaranteed. His imagination ran wild. My form circled a royal court, immune from the prayers of holy men, a whisper to lure the powerful away, my legs tight around their waists, and putting them in positions unfavored by the church. Their moans and pleads loud. They whispered for more. The realization that many portraits of powerful men's mistresses were my kind. Painted naked in my human form, my breasts were exposed, with a piece of expensive silk covering the mound down below, adorned with jewels, and it was enough to ransom kings and even emperors. Images of me drawing out their essence, through multiple methods, and whispering poison in their ears to influence policy that granted me more wealth, simply for the entertainment of it, part of the vigor of youth, perhaps, within the blink of an eye. I stood faster than his mortal eyes could see, and went to stand close to the two elevators. It beeped loudly as one set of guests came to their stop. I didn't bother to warn him. He would follow or not. I watched him jump up in alarm, confused, and looked around the lobby to see where I was, wondering whether it was a daydream, or perhaps too much influence from the media, when he caught sight of me. Every time, confirming he was dealing with an entity rather than a figment of his desire. I leaned on the marble wall, resting against the cool stone, and waited to see how quickly it would take for him to join me. I gestured with my head to the elevators in an invitation of lust, and he strode over, nearly bumping into people, and mumbling an apology to each of them, until he finally reached me. He stood close, looking confused.
Do you have a room booked?
I entered the elevator. Even though people were waiting to get in with us, they all stood back, allowing us to get in alone. One man looked up and took a step, only to jolt backward. "Does it matter?" I asked over my shoulder. I reached out to press level 7, and didn't bother to wait for Stephen to join me. He put his hand inside the door, keeping it open, and looked around to see no one inside with us. I thought for a moment he was going to question it, but instead he came and stood beside me. Stephen's imagination already ran wild. I didn't realize I found someone so creative. He imagined me taking him in the hallway, each of us taking turns with our backs against the walls, my legs tight around him, our moans echoing down that very hallway, and soon he tried to hide his arousal. He was oblivious to the rooms around us, and didn't care what the consequences would ultimately be. "Can't you wait?" I taunted him, knowing the security cameras watching us would only receive static, and a crazy and lustful man waiting inside. The elevator let out a ding, and the doors opened when we reached our floor.
No, I don't think I can,
he murmured, and as a pair, we walked down the long carpeted hallway. All the doors looked the same, except the room number with black lettering, lined with gold, and as we walked, I wanted to select the room we wouldn't be disturbed in. I could feel the warmth of the living bodies inside each room, all except room 20 that had a fresh cadaver inside. I could feel families preparing to go out together, lone travelers resting in the afternoon, and some rooms that had been freshly cleaned. We walked the furthest away from the elevators, a room off to one side, where we wouldn't be disturbed by housekeeping, or any rogue guest who overheard what was taking place. Many establishments still had skeleton keys that could open any door, despite changing to a keycard system. Once we found a suitable room, I pointed my finger at the doorknob, and my finger twisted and turned into a key. I inserted it inside the lock, turned it, and the door opened. Stephen watched in frustration, unaware that my kind could morph our bodies in such a way.
How are you able to do that? I didn't know that succubi could do that.
He asked, and I reached out with my hand and took him by his. Skin-to-skin contact, and I felt him melt in my hand. The door opened slowly. A lone, freshly made bed awaited us, and I pulled him inside. The door drawled to a close. The lock turned on its own, trapping him inside with me, and he stood at the foot of the bed. "We have many secrets your kind are oblivious to," I answered. Stephen didn't know where to look, taking in my eyes, lips, breasts, hips, and all the pleasures down below. His gaze traveled, and I wondered how much of our conversation he had taken in. "Take off your clothes," I whispered, and he started to unbuckle his belt, removing his shoes and kicking them to the side.
I still don't know if I'm dreaming. Am I? Is this real? Or are you doing that thing again, where you're inside my mind?
He asked, letting his trousers fall to the ground, and unbuttoning his shirt, and allowing it to fall. Stephen fumbled, nearly tripped, and managed to stand firm. I didn't answer him. I rested my hands on his shoulders, hooked my leg behind his, and pushed him down onto the hotel bed. Stephen had already risen to the occasion. He stared up at me as my wings spread on either side of my frame, and he was perfectly content to continue in the form I was in, something I'd never encountered previously. I climbed on top of him, caressing every inch of his body, and he relaxed, perfectly content for me to take the lead. Caught up in the sensations I provided, I straddled him with soft thighs on either side of his hips. My wings spread wide, and I could feel him beneath me. His wrists were soon pinned above his head, and again, his mind long revealed the truth of his deception. I easily entered his mind, and saw that inside his car were rope in coils, large amounts of sedatives, and a variety of loose surgical tools, ready to create his perfect doll. Whilst at home, he had a cage prepared inside his cold basement, ready and waiting for his next victim. He hoped to lure whoever came here into the back seat of his car, and expected a mortal girl he could seize and exploit, clearly prepared to take whoever came here for his own. A loud animalistic growl emitted from my lips, my back arched and teeth bared. I wanted him to admit to it all. I permitted him to enter me. Flesh combined with mental prowess broke him down.
I brought you here to try and catch you. I wanted my own personal succubus. But I thought you could have been a girl.
The words blurted out. He panicked once the realization set in.
I thought...
He moaned. Over the course of hours he climaxed repeatedly. And once eager in anticipation, it was fading. I was unwilling to grant him mercy. The visual adding to the knowing his time was at an end. Time did not exist to me. Many hours passed, and soon it was in the early morning. Every time he reached his peak, more of his life essence was being drained. And fortunately, I deprived the world of his seed. Helpless, he murmured for it to stop.
Will you kill me?
He whispered, knowing his doom was soon. You knew who I was, what I was, and yet you still approached, even knowing you could risk it all. And now, you have a better understanding of my kind. Stephen paused, his eyes cloudy from age, and his frame was gaunt, bones protruding from it. Every breath was difficult as his body started to wither, life inside a still breathing corpse. I knew it wouldn't be long now until he would expire.
I don't want to die. Please, let me go.
A final last pleading call. My kinds are not the soft, nor weak beings your kind portrays us as, wanting nothing but your essence, and your even more pitiful intimacy. I growled, my face centimeters from his, and I could see the fear in his eyes, the wide-eyed look of those who knew they were going to die. And that was by far the most arousing gesture he had made. We are the reason why your kind are so terrified of the uncanny valley between humans and those not quite human. We are your predator, and you, I leaned close, taking that last treasured breath of his, are our prey. I hope you enjoy this story. What did you think of it? Let me know what you thought in the comments section down below. Don't forget to stab the like button, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment. This video is made with the support of my incredible channel members, Patreon subscribers and all my viewers. Thank you so much for supporting me. Don't forget to check out my social media accounts below, including my merch. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.